If you let them do this, I'm finished. Please, I'm begging you, give me another chance. I'll pay anything.
For 12 years, Salvatore Rizzo had a grave with his son's name on it. Every anniversary, he stood over that headstone in the Rizzo family plot and told himself the same lie, that Dominic had died quickly, that there had been no time for fear, that somewhere his boy was at peace. It was the only lie that let him keep breathing. The truth was that Dominic Rizzo had not died at all. He had simply stopped being Dominic. It happened on a warehouse floor in Newark, the night a rival family's ambush caught the Rizzo crew off guard and left 4 men dead, Dominic among them, or so everyone believed once they found his jacket, his watch, and enough blood on the concrete to convince a coroner who was already being paid to stop asking questions. What nobody knew, because nobody was meant to know, was that Dominic had crawled out through a drainage culvert with a bullet in his shoulder and a decision already forming in his mind that would take him 12 years to fully understand. He didn't go home. Going home meant explaining why he'd survived an ambush that killed 3 other men. It meant answering questions about why he'd been the only one to walk away from a trap that had clearly been set with inside knowledge. And Dominic, bleeding out in a stranger's basement that night, already suspected something his father would never have believed, that the ambush hadn't been random bad luck. It had been arranged, and arranged by someone close enough to know exactly where the Rizzo crew would be that night. So Dominic disappeared. He built a new name, Daniel Ricci, a nothing name, a forgettable name, and spent the next 12 years working construction in Ohio, then Texas, then finally settling into a quiet accounting job in a mid-sized city where nobody had ever heard of the Rizzo family or the empire his father had spent 30 years building. He told himself he'd made peace with the choice. He told himself the same lie his father told himself at the graveside every year, that this was better, cleaner, safer for everyone involved. The lie held for 12 years. It fell apart in a single afternoon, when Daniel Ricci opened a newspaper in a diner 3 states away from his old life, and saw a photograph of his father's face, 20 years older than he remembered, standing beside a hospital entrance. The headline explained everything he needed to know in 4 words. Rizzo boss hospitalized, condition critical. Dominic sat with that newspaper for almost an hour before he made the decision that would undo 12 years of careful invisibility. He booked a flight home that same night. The Rizzo estate hadn't changed as much as Dominic expected. The same iron gates, the same gravel driveway, the same enormous house that had always felt more like a fortress than a home. What had changed was who stood guard at the gates when his car pulled up, unannounced, at 11 at night. The guard who approached the car was young, younger than Dominic had been the night he supposedly died, and clearly knew enough to the family that he had no idea who he was looking at. Estates closed to visitors, the guard said, especially tonight. I need to see Salvatore Rizzo. Mr. Rizzo isn't seeing anyone. He's not well. I know, Dominic said. That's why I'm here. Tell whoever's running things that his son wants to see him. The guard laughed, the short, disbelieving laugh of someone who'd clearly heard the family's tragic history recited at least once during his training. Rizzo's son has been dead for 12 years. I know that too, Dominic said. I was there. Something in his voice, or perhaps something in his face when the guard finally looked at him properly under the gate's floodlight, made the young man's laughter die immediately. He radioed inside without another word. 10 minutes later, Dominic found himself standing in the same study where he'd once received his first real assignment from his father at 19 years old. Except now the man behind the desk wasn't his father. It was his older cousin Anthony, who had clearly assumed control of daily operations while Salvatore's health declined, and who was staring at Dominic now with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something colder that Dominic couldn't immediately name. This is impossible, Anthony said. I understand why you'd think that. You have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't have you shot for impersonating a dead man in my uncle's house. Then you'd be shooting your cousin, Dominic said, which I understand might actually be more convenient for you than you're willing to admit right now. Anthony's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a flicker Dominic recognized immediately because he'd spent 12 years training himself to notice exactly that kind of flicker in other people's faces. Guilt, quickly suppressed, or something adjacent to guilt. Calculation, certainly. Explain, Anthony said, or I really will have you shot. So Dominic explained. The ambush, the bullet in his shoulder, the decision, made in a stranger's basement while bleeding out. That survival made more sense as someone else entirely than as a Rizzo who'd somehow escaped a trap meant to kill him, along with everyone else that night. He explained the 12 years of construction work and accounting ledgers and a life built entirely around not being noticed, until a newspaper photograph of his dying father made 12 years of careful invisibility suddenly feel like the biggest mistake of his life. "Why now?" Anthony asked, once Dominic finished. "If you've stayed hidden this long, why risk everything to come back the moment my uncle's health starts failing?" "Because I want to see him before he dies," Dominic said, "and because I never stopped wondering who set up that ambush, and I think whoever it was benefited a great deal from a version of events where I never asked that question again." Anthony's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You think someone inside the family arranged it?" "I think someone who knew exactly where the Rizzo crew would be that night, with enough detail to guarantee 3 deaths and make my survival look like an accident nobody needed to investigate, arranged it. I don't know who yet. I intend to find out." "You understand what you're accusing," Anthony said carefully. "You're suggesting a Rizzo betrayed other Rizzos. That's not an accusation men in this family forgive easily, proven or not." "I'm not accusing anyone yet," Dominic said. "I'm telling you what I plan to investigate. If you have a problem with that, it might be worth asking yourself why." The tension in the room stretched long enough that Dominic genuinely wasn't certain, for several seconds, whether Anthony would call the guards back in. Instead, Anthony finally exhaled, some of the coiled tension leaving his shoulders, and gestured toward the door. "Your father's upstairs," he said. "3rd floor, the room at the end of the hall. He doesn't have much time left, Dominic, whatever name you've been using. If you're going to see him, don't waste it arguing with me about ancient history." Salvatore Rizzo looked smaller than Dominic remembered, swallowed by hospital equipment and a bed that seemed too large for the man occupying it. He'd aged decades in the 12 years since Dominic had last seen him, and for a moment, standing in the doorway, Dominic wondered if coming back had been a mistake after all. If seeing his father this fragile would undo something in himself he'd spent 12 years carefully rebuilding. Then Salvatore's eyes opened, found him standing there, and widened with an expression Dominic had never once seen on his father's face in 19 years of childhood. Pure, unguarded shock. "It's not possible," Salvatore whispered. "I'm sorry," Dominic said, crossing the room slowly. "I'm sorry it took 12 years. I'm sorry for every year you spent standing over a grave that never should have existed." "You're alive," Salvatore's voice cracked on the words, tears finally spilling, despite whatever effort he'd clearly spent his entire life avoiding exactly this kind of visible emotion. My boy is alive." They talked for nearly 3 hours that night, longer than Salvatore's doctors would have permitted under normal circumstances, though nobody in that house was willing to interrupt a reunion 12 years in the making. Dominic explained everything again, the ambush, the decision, the years of hiding, and watched his father's face cycle through grief and relief, and something that eventually settled into quiet, focused anger. "Someone set that ambush," Salvatore said, once Dominic finished. "I always suspected it, but I could never prove it. I lost 3 good men that night, and I lost you, and I spent 12 years unable to find who was responsible. I intend to find out now," Dominic said. "Whoever it was, they benefited from believing I was dead. That means whoever it was has spent 12 years comfortable in that belief. I intend to make them uncomfortable." Salvatore's hand, thin and weak now, in ways it had never been during Dominic's childhood, gripped his son's wrist with surprising strength. "Be careful. Whoever arranged that ambush is still inside this family, close enough to have known exactly where your crew would be. That kind of person doesn't disappear just because you've come back from the dead. If anything, your return makes you a bigger threat to them than you ever were before." Dominic spent the following weeks doing quietly what he'd once done for his father, as a young man learning the family business, gathering information, patiently, without revealing how much he already suspected. He reviewed old records from the night of the ambush, cross-referencing who had known the crew's location, who had access to that information, who might have benefited most from Dominic's presumed death. The answer, when it finally surfaced, came from somewhere Dominic never expected: Anthony's own ledgers, Reviewed with permission Dominic had carefully negotiated by framing his investigation as protecting the family's interests rather than pursuing personal vengeance. Buried in financial records from 12 years earlier was a payment, small enough to have gone unnoticed for over a decade, routed through an account that eventually traced back to Anthony himself, made 3 days before the ambush, to a man Dominic recognized immediately from the file, a low-level associate in the rival family responsible for setting the trap. Dominic sat with that discovery for 2 full days before confronting anyone, turning it over from every angle, hoping desperately he'd find some innocent explanation that made the payment mean something other than what it appeared to mean. He found none. He brought the evidence to his father first, not to Anthony, understanding correctly that whatever happened next needed Salvatore's authority behind it if the family was going to survive the revelation intact. Salvatore, weak as he was, insisted on being present for the confrontation, refusing his doctor's objections with the same stubborn will that had built his empire 30 years earlier. They gathered in the same study where Dominic had first confronted Anthony upon his return, except now, Salvatore sat behind the desk himself, propped carefully in a wheelchair, while Dominic laid the financial records out one by one. "Explain this," Salvatore said, his voice weak but unmistakably commanding. Anthony studied the documents for a long moment before answering, and Dominic watched something in his cousin's posture finally break, the careful control he'd maintained for 12 years, collapsing all at once, now that the evidence made denial impossible. "You were always going to inherit everything," Anthony said quietly, addressing Dominic directly for the first time since the confrontation began. "The favorite son, the heir apparent since the day you were born. I spent my whole life working twice as hard as you for half the recognition, watching everyone assume you'd take over one day, simply because of whose son you were, not because you'd earned it any more than I had." "So you arranged an ambush that killed 3 innocent men," Salvatore said, his voice trembling now with something closer to fury than grief. "You killed 3 men who trusted you, who called you family, to eliminate my son and clear your own path to something you thought you deserved more than he did." "I didn't think you'd die," Anthony said to Dominic, ignoring Salvatore now, something desperate creeping into his voice. "I only wanted you removed from the picture long enough to prove myself, to build my own reputation without living permanently in your shadow. I never intended for anyone to actually die that night." "3 men are dead," Dominic said quietly. "Whatever you intended, that's what happened." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Dominic genuinely believed, for several seconds, that his father might order Anthony killed on the spot. Weak as Salvatore was, the old instincts for swift, brutal justice clearly still intact beneath the physical frailty. Instead, Salvatore simply closed his eyes for a long moment, breathing carefully, before finally speaking again. "You'll leave," Salvatore said. "Tonight. You'll disappear the same way my son did, except you'll do it because I'm telling you to, not because circumstances forced your hand. You'll take nothing from this family. No money, no protection, no name. If you're ever seen near anyone connected to the Rizzo family again, the mercy I'm showing you tonight will not be extended twice." Anthony left before dawn, disappearing into whatever life remained available to a man who had spent 12 years quietly poisoning the foundation of the only family he'd ever known. Nobody in the organization ever learned the full truth of what happened that night, only that Anthony had left suddenly, and that questions about his departure were, without exception, discouraged. Salvatore Rizzo lived another 8 months after that confrontation, long enough to formally reinstate Dominic as his son and heir, long enough to watch Dominic slowly rebuild relationships with cousins and associates who had spent 12 years believing him dead and now had to relearn, carefully, how to trust a man who had returned from a grave that had never actually held him. It wasn't an easy rebuilding. Some in the organization never fully trusted Dominic's return, suspicious of a man who had chosen 12 years of hiding over facing whatever truth waited for him at home. Others embraced him immediately, relieved to see the family's rightful heir finally back where he belonged. Dominic took over formally the week after his father's funeral, standing at a graveside that finally, truthfully, held the man it was meant to hold, rather than a lie constructed to protect a fragile peace that had never actually existed. "Do you regret it?" his cousin Elena asked him months later, one of the few relatives who had welcomed him back without hesitation from the very first night. 12 years hidden, when you could have come home, exposed Anthony, and claimed everything so much sooner? Dominic considered the question carefully before answering, the way he'd learned to consider everything carefully during 12 years of building an entirely different life under an entirely different name. "I didn't know it was Anthony," he said. "For 12 years, I only knew someone inside the family had betrayed us, and I didn't know who I could trust enough to investigate safely. Coming home too soon, without knowing who set that ambush, might have gotten me killed for real the second time, and this time nobody would have survived to come back. And now? Now I know exactly who to trust," Dominic said, "because I learned exactly who not to. That's worth more than 12 years. Even if it cost me 12 years, I can never get back." Years later, when people spoke of Dominic Rizzo's unlikely return from the dead, most versions of the story emphasized the dramatic reunion, the confrontation, the swift justice delivered to a cousin who had betrayed his own blood for a shot at power he'd never truly earned. Few people understood the quieter truth underneath all of it. That surviving 12 years as someone else had taught Dominic something his upbringing as the favored son never could have. It taught him patience. It taught him how to watch a room full of people and notice exactly who deserved trust and who didn't, the same skill that had once made him careless enough to walk into an ambush, and later careful enough to make certain it never happened to him again. The grave with his name on it remained in the family plot for years afterward, never fully removed, a strange monument to the life Dominic had once lived, and the death he'd never actually died. He visited it sometimes, standing over the stone the way his father once had, understanding finally what Salvatore must have felt every year for 12 years, grief for something that had been true, gratitude for something that ultimately wasn't, and the strange, permanent weight of knowing exactly how close an entire family had come to losing everything to a betrayal none of them saw coming until it was almost too late.